Okay, welcome back. Glad you're back with us. Now, today we're going to be talking about unanswered prayer. There's a lot of times that we say, well, there's three answers to prayer. There's yes, no, or not now. But I want to talk about what happens when they seem unanswered. Laura Story put out a song a few years back in where she talked about what if life's hardest trials were actually mercies in disguise. And that's where we think we're going through this great trial, it's actually sparing us or helping us in ways that we don't see or we don't understand. God is so powerful and omniscient that when he answers for his children, it's for the best. Let's talk about David. Let's go back a little bit in history so that we can talk about setting up for this next Maskell Psalm, which is Psalm 44. But David now has been on the run from Saul for several years. And Saul has pursued him, and he's stopped to go fight Philistines, and he's come back, and he's pursued him again, and then he's gone chase the enemy. And so it's been this back and forth, whether David's being pursued. And so David has had to flee south. And there is a city, Ziklag, which one of the Philistine kings, because there's several of them, gave him as a city to occupy. And so David and his army, their families, they all live there in Ziklag. David, however, his heart is still with the Israelites. And so he will conduct raids, and then he will kill all survivors. So there's no way for anybody to know. And these raids are on the Philistines and not the Israelites. Here David is working undercover for Israel, and the Philistines are trusting him, or at least this one king is. So there comes to this point where there's this big battle, and there's several kings that are amassing their armies to attack Saul. And Saul, this is where he goes and he consults the medium, the witch of Endor. Saul has really fallen far from God's grace. And so David, talking to the king of the Philistine, he has arranged to where he can bring up the rear with his army to the Philistines whenever they march against Saul. This is strategically a great move, because as they begin to attack Saul, David has them from behind where they have no place to run. And they actually have a pincer move where they can attack from both sides. As I said before, there are several Philistine kings, and some of the other Philistine kings, once David was there, they said, no, we don't want him there. Send him back home. And so his friend had to send him back home. And so David went back to Ziklag. Let's remember that for years, David has prayed to God for relief from Saul's pursuit. And he has vowed to God that he is not going to lift a finger against him. He's had 2 instances he could have easily killed Saul, but he didn't. So David here is now on his way back to Ziklag, and Saul looks like he's going to have to face the enemy alone. But David's just right there, so if he needs to, he can always bring his army. But as David approaches Ziklag, the Amalekites have raided Ziklag, and they've taken their kids, their wives, all their belongings, and they've headed off. Now, if that sounds familiar, remember Saul and who he was supposed to destroy utterly and completely so they couldn't rebuild? It was the Amalekites. And it's these very Amalekites that have come back and raided Ziklag because Saul didn't destroy them. So now David is grief-struck. His men are ready to kill him. And he is crying to God, what do I do? God tells him, go after your family, go after your wives, your belongings, and find the Amalekites. Well, the Amalekites fled in the opposite direction of the battle. They fled towards Egypt, and it took David 3 days. And when he did catch up with them, he did destroy them, and all of his belongings were returned, plus other bounty. So David comes back to Ziklag, but by then Saul had already lost the battle, and Saul and his sons were killed. Let's look at that a minute, because David certainly didn't want Saul and his sons to die. However, God also had promised David the throne, because if you remember, he was anointed as a boy by Samuel. Because of Saul's disobedience and not destroying all the Amalekites, David was removed from the battle, and Saul was killed. So all these prayers that David had been praying were answered. They just weren't answered in the way he wanted them, but they were answered to the best way there was. It removed Saul from the kingship and his family from the kingship, so that there would be no squabbling over the kingdom and the heirs of Saul. This psalm also fits into a particular group of psalms called Lament psalms. Now, what is a lament psalm? A lament psalm is one that expresses great sorrow. And the sorrow usually has one of 3 different sources. 1, it could be from something that they have done. 2, it could be something that somebody else has done. And 3, the obvious, it could be something that God has done. Now, one of the interesting things about that you will see throughout the Psalms, and it brings up the question, why does God allow all this negative talk about I'm being persecuted, why don't you rescue me, etc., in the Psalms? And one of the things that we need to look at when that's happening is that the psalmist, they never question God's existence. But what they question is his methodology. Now, if we were taking the Psalms as being inspired, and this is coming from God, questioning God's methodology is okay. But we never question his sovereignty, and we never question his existence. We can question his methodology, because after all, God's ways are much higher than man's ways, and we just don't understand things sometimes. We can ask why God doesn't answer prayers. But to do this, we need to realize that sometimes God's, what we see as silence, is actually his sovereignty at work. Everything is his. He gets to choose how he wants to handle things. He gets to choose how he works in our lives. Now, one thing that we need to understand, because sometimes we feel attacked by Satan. And we think that because all these things that are going on in our life, Satan is attacking us. But what we as Christians need to understand is that when Satan attacks, he's not attacking us. He's attacking God. He's attacking Christ, not us. We just happen to be holding Christ in our lives. So when Satan attacks, God knows, because Satan's attacking him. I want to introduce a musical term which most people are not familiar with. It's called appoggiatura. Now, this is that musical technique is when you make a chord and one of the notes in the chord is in dissonance with the rest of the notes. it sounds funny. It sounds strange and weird. But what happens with this particular musical term or technique, that dissonant note slides into consonance with the other. And so you have this, what starts off as a weird sounding chord that comes into a very beautiful sounding chord. The reason I bring this up is lots of times in our lives, we are that dissonant note and we are not fitting into God's will. But when we slide into that position of consonance, we then make this beautiful chord that is harmonious and pleasant to hear. Our lives need to be in tune with God's will. And when this happens, it's not the chord that changes, it's a dissonant note that changes to fit the chord. Just like we need to fit into God's will instead of having God's will fit into our wants, our wishes. In the conclusion of the psalm, there are three things that we need to note. One, physical life clings to physical nature, which means that we are tied to this physical nature. And we want to hold on to it. And we want to preserve it at all costs. Physical life clings to physical nature. The second point, God helps us and redeems us from this state. That's not to say He doesn't provide, because He does. But He redeems us from us wanting that first and foremost in our lives and clinging to it. The third and final most important point, God's love is ever present. We are told that He will not leave us nor forsake us, and there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. So when we feel like our prayers are not being answered, we need to remember, one, is it our physical life clinging to physical nature? We need to remember that God redeemed us from this. And three, God loves us, and that's not going to change. All right, in chapter 7, we'll be talking about Psalm 32, which has to deal with guilt and forgiveness. I hope you've enjoyed the video so far, but I want to encourage you to also get the book, Lyrics by Adonai. Not only does it allow a more in-depth study of the Psalms, but it's filled with questions and meditations, and it's a great study guide for either personal study or a group Bible study. And remember, just as stone sharpens stone, share it with a friend, and then talk about it after.